Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Awareness Podcast with your host, Bill Free. And this week, I have a man he's one of our speakers at the previous conference, the Know Thyself conference. He's Australian, a wonderful person. I know you'll agree with me, even just partly into this podcast. And his name is Roger Castillo. Thank you for being here today, Roger. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be here.
When we met each other, Roger, before the Know Thyself conference, and then as I hosted your session for the conference, which I very much enjoyed, I finished the conference feeling like, man, I really feel like Roger has something to say about something that's very close to my heart, because of some things that you said in the pre-conference conversation that we had, and then at the conference you said a few things, and that is the idea of, especially since you were a Course in Miracles student, and you moved into, which is, it's a non-dual, dual progressive path in my view. It's a non-dual understanding that points to non-duality using duality to do it. And then you were you went to the direct non-dual understanding and teaching. And if I use the wrong words, you can correct me when you respond. But Ramesh was your teacher, or it was your inspiration and your guru. And it's like you, and you also talked about the Zen path, the Zen Buddhist path, the progressive path of Zen Buddhism. And I feel that you have an understanding of many traditions that are out there. And one of the things that I really wanted to highlight from your journey and from what you're inspired to bring today is how the non-dual understanding, or the direct path, and the progressive path, the Course in Miracles or the Zen path, how the two of them fit together perfectly as almost like two puzzle pieces in the awakening experience. And I'd like to hear your take on the importance of the non-dual, really inviting the duality in as a part of its experience, and how the duality, the progressive path, really bridges over and invites the non-dual in. And would you say that those two parts are necessary, or are they the yin and the yang of awakening that brings you to the point of understanding and what we would call enlightenment?
Yeah, it's a great topic, and I don't think they, as I said, we can sort of see them as two different approaches that complement each other. That's one way of seeing it. I don't really think that the non-dual awakening is in and of itself a path. I think it is part of the process. So what we refer to as the direct path, which tends to lead to, if it brings about the shift, then it tends to create a spontaneous realization of something that hadn't been realized before. And as I'd like to look at it, I would say that is one section of a progressive path. So it fits in, that non-dual awakening and realization fits into an overall progression. And that isn't how it's presented when we're in that section, in that part, in that awakening section. It's not useful to present it like that, because if it is presented as part of a progression, it would fail to be potent in delivering what it actually is intended to deliver.
Yeah.
So I'd like, given that this is the tangent, or the direction that we go in, I'd like to suggest that why that is so important, the non-dual realization, is because being a participant on Earth in daily life, there is a lot of duality, at least on the surface. There's a lot of distinction between a lot of the different objects and the interaction between those objects. Yet all of those different pieces, all of those different components are part of a whole. And where we sort of get led as part of the human development from a young age is that we see all the parts, our attention, our perception, and therefore our brain and how it processes all this sees a whole lot of separate parts. And it doesn't even see them as parts, it just sees what's important to it. And we could look at it like a tree. You've got a tree with leaves and with fruit and with flowers and a trunk and bark and branches, and it's a singular tree, but it does have a lot of components that you could focus in on. And not seeing life as a whole, not seeing the interaction and understanding the connectivity of life as a whole, tends to have its significant problems. And that's where the non-dual awakening is so important, because it does tend to unify the whole in a way that is not the standard development of our perception. And once that has happened, once someone realizes that all the parts are actually part of a whole, and so non-duality will say there aren't many parts, or there is no separation, there is just the one. And to me, the one is life, in practical terms. One is life. We don't see life as a cohesive whole, so that means that we see the other as an independent, autonomous entity separate from me, and therefore we can hate them. And that's where the suffering comes in.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing everything as one isn't the be-all and end-all. Without that, we can't have the healing, or the clarity, the true perception, I think, is maybe how it's referred to in the Course in Miracles, if my memory serves me correct. And yet we have to continue after liberation, after enlightenment, to live in a world of duality in practical terms, where I have a car and I get into a car and my car takes me from one place to another. And so that's why I say that the spontaneous awakening, the realization of the cohesive whole of life, is not necessarily all that has to happen. There's a lot of other changes that need to take place that complement that, and that to me is what I would call the integration.
Yeah. I like the way you put that, because there is a tendency for non-dual students to feel that non-duality is especially when you hear the two words the direct path. Oh, I'm going the direct path, you know, and like and I'm that other one's a little slower. That's a long way up. I'm going the direct path, and the truth is and I like the way you use the word, the potency of the direct path. Is it's an important distinction because it does give you the glimpse that sees beyond anything that you've ever experienced before, even if it's a momentary glimpse or a feeling or something different that is profound, something different, and it gives you a basis of saying, what was that? And then the distinction that it gives you is it allows you to find that place that's untouchable by time and space, by the time and space experience. However, you can't relate from there. It's
That's
like
right.
you just said, you can't relate to the world if you just think that you live in this mystical glimpse experience, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's why in the end we need to say, so in practical terms, really, because you can have all sorts of wonderful realizations and glimpses and peak experiences and realizations of things that haven't been realized, as in your own essence. Maybe you can realize the fact that awareness is the container of our life experience, and yet a whole lot of dynamics that create suffering can still persist even after those realizations, although those realizations are the basis on which they get undone. There's a very specific movement after the realization that needs to take place to undo certain psychological constructs that will continue to exist after the realizations. And so that's where we need to ask the question, in practical terms, we ask it to the awakened human being, someone who has had the direct realization. What are you really looking for in practical terms? And at the right time, that question will be significant for a seeker. It won't be significant early on in the awakening process, because once that aspect of life that had been completely overlooked for a whole lifetime presents itself, it seems like that's it. That's all. That's what I was missing. And so for a long time, the question of, in practical terms, what are you looking for? That won't be useful, or it won't seem interesting, because they say, I've got everything that I was looking for now. I've now realized that I didn't realize before. However, if I'm correct, if my statement is correct, that realization doesn't necessarily undo a whole lot of the psychological structures. It definitely gives it a good shake, and is the basis on which the structure will then fall. What we see, and you'll see this in non-dual circles, is a lot of awakened people that still under, in certain circumstance, find themselves flipping out of that connection, and the separation attitude of hatred and blame and judgment and wanting life to be different and feeling that we haven't taken advantage, we haven't done the right thing, we're missed out. All of that can kick back in again. And so once someone has realized that the realization hasn't got rid of that, and that their uncomfortableness with life still persists, that's when the question, what are you really looking for in practical terms? That's when it might hit. And I'd say, because what's the use of having this realization if one's suffering continues to arise from time to time? And so that's what I mean by that realization is part of a greater process. And it has its place. And without the realization, I think it's very hard for that structure to collapse. Primarily because it shows us a space outside of concept, outside of thought, and it in the showing us of that space outside of thought and outside of concept, it also reveals an essence that the human being is, which is luckily what we are, because that essence is already at peace, is already happy, isn't afraid, isn't doesn't feel insecure, doesn't feel shame, doesn't feel guilt. And so it's a combination of finding a place that doesn't require an interpretation of life through our old concept, and a connection to that self that delivers the basis on which we can be happy in practical terms, meaning the end of suffering, the end of the uncomfortableness with oneself. And once we frame it that way, then the next phase of integration can happen. If we're phrasing it as, what we're really looking for is to be aware of awareness, then that's the phrasing, that's the objective when we're in that phase of non-dual awakening. And so that's the focus needs to be reframed as we move through the different phases of freedom.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I like something that you mentioned that I wrote down from the conference session that was brilliant. And your title for the conference, I think, was constant, unbroken. Can you remember what it was? The
unbroken peace of mind in daily living.
Yeah, unbroken peace of mind in daily living. And you mentioned something that I wrote down. It said, living the non-dual dual understanding. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great idea to invite our listening audience or viewing audience to just to sort of look at that a little bit, because I feel that's where we all end up. And this is where you brought me in as I was hosting your session. I really loved your session. And if you're listening or watching and you didn't get to watch it, we still have that conference available, Know Thyself conference, and you can find it at on billfree.com or teachersofgod.org or Pure Presence conferences. Go to that, and maybe I have an idea that we're going to take your session, Roger, and we're just going to put it on YouTube for free, just so people can see it and get a taste of that great conversation that we had, because it inspired me when you were expressing this idea of non-dual duality, because in that conversation, we started out talking about non-duality. Then we moved over to, we started about talking about duality. Then we moved over to non-duality. Then you started talking about non-dual duality. And because you end up right back at the same place after awakening, after enlightenment, you end up right at the same place that you started, only you're a little bit wiser.
Yeah, that's right. If enlightenment meant we get extracted out of life on earth and then we're in the holy grail, in heaven or wherever, in reality, if that's what it was all about, and when we have the aha moment, that's it, we get extracted out, we're no longer here, then we don't end up in the same place, just with a different attitude, different perspective, different wisdom, different understanding. It's about living in a completely different, let's say, I don't know, world or non-world or whatever. The truth is that the sages of history continue to live after realization, after enlightenment, as a human being on this planet, functioning according to the laws of cause and effect. And so, we can't, our concepts can be very powerful at creating an imagination or an idea of what something is. And that idea that our imagination creates can leave parts that are very much still relevant out. And so reframing the seeking at a certain point as being, hey, we have to continue to live as a human being after liberation. And therefore, what does liberation deliver for the human being? And I would, summarize the answer to that question as being, well, doesn't even need to be a summary. Liberation is a liberation from the suffering that was part of our life experience before. And by suffering, I don't mean the pains of circumstance, physical pain, emotional pain, financial pain, and the opposite pleasures, physical pleasures, emotional pleasures. They will continue to be there, but the psychological load of suffering that is added in and makes us essentially feel uncomfortable with ourselves and uncomfortable with the other, that is what liberation, in my experience, delivers in practical terms, which then means we get to continue to live as a human being, but free of that load of suffering.
Yeah. 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 And that's the old age phrase that Jesus expressed in, thousands of years past, and we still didn't understand living in the world and not of the world. That's living in the world
Mm-hmm.
and knowing that you're not primarily, you're not this bodysuit. However, on a relative level, you're experiencing everything that a bodysuit experiences, but you're not using your old conditioned ideas or belief system. It's not running the show anymore. And in fact, what's running the show, you're not in charge of. You're not in charge of it. So you let it run its course, and it's a much easier course to move through because it doesn't have your resistance involved.
Yeah, I completely agree. In practical terms, I'd say, because I think it's worth, you'll hear me say in practical terms, because I think at some point it's very important for us to refocus on what is here, and the awakening part needs us to not focus on what is here in terms of a large part of what is here, in order for us to realize the bit that is here that has been overlooked. And so in order for attention to land on that, which is a much less tangible, the tangible needs to, in a way, be diminished. And often it's diminished by calling it unreal, illusion, error, a misunderstanding, and that's very valid, because it's the methodology that allows our attention to essentially not be as identified with those things as it previously was, which is why we eventually, there can be this awakening to the background or the formless, which is not available when our attention is on all of the tangible stuff. But at some point we need to refocus on that and see if we have eliminated aspects that are still very relevant and bring them back into our field of awareness and perception. And I would say that it is our attachment to outcomes that is the primary root of human suffering. Meaning, and what does attachment to outcomes mean? It means that we are convinced that the happiness that we don't experience when we're a seeker, that we're convinced, or even prior to being a seeker, we're convinced that the unhappiness, that the happiness that we don't have will be found in the future because of a circumstance, because we've become financially independent, or because we've found a soulmate, or because we have become a perfect person that does no wrong. We've invented something, or we've been so kind to the world that everyone loves us. Any one of those different outcomes is what we imagine will be the reason why one day I will be able to feel comfortable and happy. And that is not where happiness, that the true happiness stems from. It will never be delivered because we have circumstance, and there's plenty of evidence for that. We just need to start looking at the evidence, both in our own experience. We've got things that we've wanted, things that we were sure were going to give us this comfortableness, and it didn't give us the comfortableness. And there are people in the world that have been blessed with so much good fortune in terms of circumstance, and a lot of those people will admit, but I don't have an ease and a comfortableness, or what we could call happiness in life. And so in practical terms, I think it's so important for us to start to see that when the suffering arises, even after awakening, it's because the psychological movement has continued down its old path of getting involved in what someone has done, what we have done that has delivered maybe not perfect outcomes or not great outcomes. And then that's the involvement in outcomes. And that's very much linked to this notion, I am this bodysuit, because the bodysuit is on the plane of the physical. Outcomes are on the plane of the physical. And so it makes sense if we see ourselves only as a physical entity, we think, well, the only way for me to have more is if it's more circumstance, more physicality, more things delivered to me. And that's really the mental movement, the psychological movement that needs to be seen and cut off once we realize that is the basis of our suffering. And that allows us to come back to that quiet place, the formless place. When we're involved in outcomes, thinking that that's where our completeness is to be found, there can't be a quietness, a coming back to the simple fact that we already exist right now.
Right. Can you give a process right now to our listeners that would invite them to see that a glimpse of the self that we're speaking about, so that they would have a direct an understanding of their own seeing? Can you do that?
I tend not to focus on the realization of yourself as a standalone thing. I tend to point at the psychological movements that are what keep us disconnected from that.
Okay.
Because the talking about those things will maybe allow that new conditioning to become part of the seeker's up-to-date conditioning, which then is a very functional up-to-date conditioning. It's not a problematic up-to-date conditioning, and it's just pointers, it's descriptions. And that, in combination with awareness, might land on those dynamics, and then we'll be able to realize, oh, it's my judgment of the other that does life different to me, that drags me out of this connection to self. Or if someone hasn't found that connection to self, they might see that whenever they're judging the others, they are inherently feeling uncomfortable with themselves. Even though it seems like it's an uncomfortableness with the other, it is a resistance to life as it is, because the other is just an expression of life as it is. So I like to point out the various forms of suffering, and then state that the dropping into self is a movement when there is a stop, in a spontaneous stop in the moment, which is a stop that happens when we realize that that movement of the psychological movement, the judgment, the craving for things in the future that I don't have now, is maybe what prevents us from knowing ourselves truly. Yeah. So once we become really familiar with the different forms of suffering, then there might be this stop.
Yeah.
And that's when the self might be revealed.
I think in my experience, the stop, that's the real value of self-inquiry. In self-inquiry, you're bringing that's where the mind that was busy, the chitty chatter, the projections, all of those objects of experience, they come to that stop. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. And this is why sometimes, especially if we're still in this exclusive dualistic mode of thinking, well, if something must be good and something must be bad. If I describe a shortcoming of something, to me, that's just a description. It's like, you can have a very powerful car or tractor or whatever, but it doesn't go fast. And so but it's very powerful, but it doesn't go fast. And so if I say, that tractor really doesn't move very fast, that to me is just a description of one of its characteristics. It doesn't mean it has no value. And we often hear that if I say, that really doesn't move very fast, and then automatically we think, oh, that's a judgment, and it's saying it's not any good. And so any of the different parts, methodologies of the spiritual process will have their inevitable shortcomings, and so I think that and so when I point those shortcomings out, it's not saying that there's something wrong with it. It's right. Just describing one of the shortcomings. And so the non-dual direct pointing, to me, has shortcomings, but it is so profound and it is so needed because it takes us out of thought, if it's effective. And a lot of the other descriptions are descriptions of thought. And so their shortcomings is that they may well just keep us locked in thought.
Yeah, looping.
Which then means we don't get the stop. We don't get to find that place outside of thought. Mm-hmm. And so when I am providing concepts, I'm continuously including concepts that say, what we're really looking for is the end of the thinking mind, the end of the part of the mind that creates suffering. So hopefully that can mitigate the problem where a concept just keeps us going round over and over in thinking. And so this is why I value the direct pointing, because it is a way of creating that realization without concepts. It's it still is using concepts, because any words that are presented are concepts, but they're concepts that are not designed to be logical concepts. They're just concepts that point in a place to the place where we can have that direct realization. I forgot what your question was, but anyway.
Well, I was interested in offering an experiential idea that would cause someone to have that pause, to have that stop experience that you're speaking of. And, and what I'm hearing is what I think I'm hearing is that you like to give the descriptions of the concepts, and I'm not sure how they have the experience.
You see, they won't provide a spontaneous. So there are ways of leading an audience in a 5 or 10 minute period to potentially having that realization. And it would be it's a very specific method that is essentially shutting off certain functionings of the brain. We won't necessarily interpret it that way, but that's what it's doing in my interpretation, is the instructions that are being given in terms of essentially what would be described as a pointer to your true nature, are just shutting off. They're turning off the brain as it normally functions. And the brain throws in a whole lot of objects that create this duality. And as those are turned off, we might spontaneously have a realization of, oh, wow, this is different. Because certain components have been switched off that then allow the experience to be different. And that changed experience is often related to or referred to as truth, reality, not experience, etc. I'd say it's just a different experience that doesn't have certain components of the brain, which can be create a very dualistic sense. So what I'm suggesting is that there is another process that won't create a spontaneous awakening potentially in this moment, in this session. It means people need to resonate with the concepts and listen to them over and over again. And as a process of having listened to 2 hours, 10 hours, maybe 100 hours, it could happen after 2 or 3 hours. Right? But it could be that you need to listen to 100 or 200 hours of the concepts, because the concepts essentially create a framework. And once that framework becomes embedded in your system, and as you're moving through life, there is continuous awareness on those aspects that have been described in the framework, aspects that are described, and they're talking about very everyday movements. That creates an understanding that is a much more maybe gradual understanding, which can lead to the realization of self, but simultaneously what it's also doing is it diminishes the psychological identity, whereas the direct pointings can create to a realization of self very quickly, but it doesn't tend to dissolve the psychological identity. But as I said, they both will have their strong points and their shortcomings. So it's a matter of resonance for the seeker.
I feel that in my mind, A Course in Miracles actually is laid out as that process, that movement, that gradual dismantling. Lots of concepts are given, and gradually, and it's 365 workbook lessons, 31 chapters in the text, a manual for teachers, a psychological pamphlet, a song of prayer, all of these different tools for, and this is years, years go by, and I know people that are doing A Course in Miracles, probably listening, that have been doing the course for 10, 20, 30 years, and they haven't had that direct experience yet because they're still doing the workbook lessons, and they're still doing the forgiveness lessons. And I feel that there's a prolonging unnecessarily of those processes where the direct path, as you rightfully said, the direct path can give you the direct experience, and then you have to work backwards, going back to undo the things that are still there. And even though you think you had your awakening, you still have to undo all that stuff, right?
Yeah, there's a saying, a Zen saying. It says, "Awakening is spontaneous, and deliverance is gradual." And to me, what that's pointing out is the awakening is not liberation itself. Awakening is a very significant revelation, and then there is a process of deliverance that is gradual, and takes time. And I think it's very much important in that deliverance for us to understand what we are looking for in practical terms, because then the focus comes back down to daily living, and that's when we can start looking at the remnants of the suffering. And with the realization piece in place, then with awareness then landing on the psychological movements that are still functioning, there's a very intuitive and direct knowing that allows us to see the error or the unreality of that psychological self. And it's then that the psychological self can collapse much more effectively than when there is a continuous assumption that this psychological self is real. So yeah, the Course in Miracles, I agree, is laid out that way. And I think it really depends who a teaching is talking to. There's so much talk of healing in A Course in Miracles, and talking about physical illness. And I think that's just there because it will attract people that are attached to an outcome, the outcome of being free from their physical pain, for example, which is a lot of the population. And so it's a trick in a way to keep someone interested so that the other wisdom can infiltrate. However, if that person is too attached to that outcome, then all they're going to be looking for is freedom from their physical illness, thinking that that's what it's about. So it has its shortcomings once again, and in the end, it comes down to destiny as to how this information actually lands with each individual person.
Yeah. So how would you? I wrote something down from that you said in your session at the conference. I loved how you were speaking about Ramana Maharshi and his teaching, and you're talking to one of the questioners in your session, and you were talking about taking your hands off the steering wheel, and then you said there's nothing we can do about life, and you used a Ramana kind of a saying or a quote: "Everything happens in life according to the great ordainer."
Yes. Yeah.
So how does one who's on the path, who hasn't really had that self-realization experience yet, how would they approach the idea of turning their life or releasing themselves to the great ordainer, as you mentioned in the session, as Ramana teaches?
Yeah. So I'll reiterate the phrase, because without that, it might not make that much sense. He says, everything in life happens according to the great ordainer. No matter what force in the universe tries to make something that is not destined happen, it will not happen. no matter what force tries to stop something that is destined from happening, it will still happen. Therefore, with this understanding, the obvious path is to remain silent. Everything happens according to the great ordainer. Now, so essentially what that's pointing at is that life is unfolding, life is happening. And not only the life outside of us, but that which we take as our actions, our movements. So the thinking, the emotions that arise, the words that come out, the hand gestures, all of that is happening according to, we could call it consciousness, we could call it God, we could call it source, we could call it the great ordainer. And that is a basic realization, or it's a fundamental realization that comes with the seeing, the non-dual seeing, is that we see that life happens and it doesn't happen the way that we have conceptualized that it happens. In fact, when we stop conceptualizing, life continues to happen. The heart continues to beat, the liver continues to filter, and thinking continues to happen, speaking continues to happen, the body continues to move. If the roof fell in next to me, the body would get up quickly and move away. And so that's an example of how we don't need to think about things. There will be movement that spontaneously happens because there's an inherent intelligence. And even our thinking, or thinking that we think is my thinking, is an output. It is a consequence of the biological structure, the way we are. And yet we have claimed ownership over so many of the functions that happen through the body, and say, well, that was my action, that was my thought, that was my anger or my kindness. And so this basic pointer is saying everything is happening according to life. It's happening as part of a bigger structure, a bigger mechanism. And so even without the direct oneness realization, we can still come to or move closer to this understanding that life is happening simply based on causality and duality. So if we realize that our thoughts and our actions are based on our genetic makeup and our up-to-date conditioning, that we're a very complex machine, and someone likes dogs and someone doesn't like dogs. So if the one that is afraid of dogs sees a dog, there will be fear arising. In someone else, they see a dog and they might feel joy. Now we might claim ownership over that. Say, that was my fear. I shouldn't feel fear. From a very simple, practical perspective, it might not be that hard for someone to realize, oh, this body-mind organism, according to its design, and we can just say the sperm and the egg come together and then it turns into what we are now, something we didn't control, we didn't determine, and we didn't determine which family we were born into, which political system, which religious system, which country, and we went to a school that we didn't choose. There were teachers that we didn't choose, and we were conditioned. So the human being is a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that we've never had any control over. And so we might get horribly angry. It might be one of our traits. And it's not your doing. Now, this isn't meant to be an excuse. It's an actual just description. Now, if someone turns it into an excuse, okay, that's destiny. That's how it was processed by that person. It's a simple description that says, the person that murders someone is driven by their particular makeup and the circumstance they find themselves in. It doesn't say, it's not saying murdering is okay or murdering is nice. It's just saying it is a happening according to a very complex system, both the human system being a very complex system and the greater system that the human system arises in. And so we may, if that concept lands and we think about it more and more appreciation of the non-doership of life, the fact that even the murderer is a part of the design of the great ordainer. And we have to also realize at some point that we might have an idea of what the great ordainer is, and then we'll say, why would God create murderers? Maybe the great ordainer is just a term for something much less personal than we would start off imagining. And at that point, when the great ordainer is seen maybe to not be a person or a deity, then we may have an even a greater chance of just seeing the impersonalness of it, which includes the good and the bad, the pleasurable and the painful.
So how would one best use that description or that understanding in the most in a way that would help them to get out of their own way?
Mm-hmm.
Any ideas?
Well, first we need to, this is why I think it's so important, if we see the suffering that arises in practical terms, and guilt and blame and pride, we can look at those three, guilt, blame and pride. They are what make us feel uncomfortable and unhappy in life when they are present. So if we see that when the other functions in life differently to how we would like, and there is this movement of resisting the fact that that's how they are functioning, even if it's not a direct impact on my life. We might see something on television, someone speaking, and we have this resistance to them being alive, essentially, and having that view. If we start seeing that is our uncomfortableness, our unhappiness, there's a chance that this understanding that everyone is functioning according to their design and it's not in their control, can one mean we can laugh at ourselves and see that our resistance to the other is also not in our control. So we can say, oh, I'm not the one causing my unhappiness, it's happening. And yet the seeing of it might lead to it happening less in the future, meaning the judgment of the other. Because the thought might come up and say, actually, who am I to say they shouldn't be that way? Who am I to say life should be this way? And when we look at what we think, when we say life should be this way, essentially we've got a mental construct, an expectation in our head of how God should have made life. When we see that mental expectation of how God should have made life, and we see that is actually interfering with and in conflict with how God has made life. Right? So that all of these pointers may actually lead to a very simple realization where we go, oh, I'm saying God should have made life my way. What about I fall into line with how God has made life? That's the end of separation, in practical terms.
I like the idea of, I fell into an understanding of awareness a dozen years ago. I just had this idea that awareness is everything. It just came on me that awareness was everything. It took me 10 years to figure out what that meant. And it feels like what you're describing is resting as awareness. It feels like you're describing allowing, and in that would be this place of that allows life to inform you, like you said a few minutes ago. um, uh, the, the intelligence of awareness. I was weed eating the other day, just a couple days ago. I was weed eating, and I didn't have goggles on.
Mm-hmm.
I hit a piece of, I saw a piece of gravel, right? I saw the weed eater hit the gravel. I saw the piece of gravel that was going to hit my eye before it flung into my eye. And something told my eye to close and protect it before the gravel that I saw could hit it.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty amazing.
It is, yes.
That's an intelligent, but I paused after that happened and I went, oh my God, that was faster than a nanosecond.
Mm-hmm.
That awareness informed the eye to close and protect it.
Mm-hmm.
And that intelligence is available to all of us.
Yes. And we just get in the way of it. As in, when I say we, what I would call the thinking mind gets in the way of that a lot of the time. It bogs the system down. So that when you say what I'm talking about is resting in awareness, it is, but instead of talking about resting in awareness, I guess I'm pointing at what keeps us away from awareness, because if someone is full of judgment, awareness, there's no capacity for there to be a finding of that place outside of concept, outside of time and space. So that's why it is sometimes worthwhile also attacking the mechanisms that prevent us from resting in awareness. So take judgment, for example. If we can give the system a rationale that makes sense to the system, that says your judgment is maybe irrational. You are judging how the other should be according to your preference. You're saying that's how they should be because I would like them to be that way, or because it will be more pleasurable in life for others if that person was that way. And I say, how do we know that that's the benchmark of how things should be, which could cut off judgment? And if the judgment is cut off, what we'll find ourselves doing is allowing life to be, which is the role that awareness plays. Awareness doesn't judge. Awareness doesn't insist on. Awareness witnesses what is. So this is why in the awareness teachings that will aim at creating a spontaneous awakening, one of the most used tools is to say there is no such thing as good and bad.
Right.
There is only what is. And that is an attempt to decondition the mind from polarizing everything into what should be and what shouldn't be. Because we're running around with an expectation of how life should be that is just creating an opposition with how life is. And so the closer we can come to those insistences on life being different falling away, the closer we are to the awareness aspect of ourself truly being able to function. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. That's a really good way to to bring us into the final question I have. We only have about 5 minutes left for the show, and I would just want to ask, how important is it to be open, Roger, to the understanding that it's helpful to have to know both the non-dual and the dual path, and how would one really find that understanding, to be open to both the non-dual and the direct path?
Well, I think it's important that, or it's important to be open to one or the other at different times, for the seeker, to be open to the progressive set of concepts, for example, while it's time for someone to be focusing on the non-dual, might actually be counterproductive.
Right.
And for someone to be focusing on the non-dual when it's time for them to be looking at the practical daily living part, which is often, it can precede awakening or be required after awakening, can be counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, I think our understanding makes us capable of knowing where each has its place, and actually seeing that neither description is a description of truth or reality, but rather the whole described from a certain perspective. So the non-dual perspective is looking at the whole from a certain position, and the dual perspective, the wisdom-filled dual perspective, is looking at life and describing the truth or reality from a specific perspective. And you can look at the yin-yang symbol as a good example of this. If the yin-yang symbol is a whole, and if we're focused on the duality, the black and the white, we might miss the fact that it is a single, let's say, item or single object. And if we come to see that it is actually a single object, we may stop seeing the black and the white. And it depends on what is trying to be pointed at. So if someone is obsessed with seeing the black and the white and can't see that it is actually also a single object, then we will diminish the fact that the black and white exist and say, look, it's actually just one single object. And so it is truth to see it as one single object. And from another point of view, we can also see the duality being the black and the white. Mm-hmm. And the duality is not non-truth, and the oneness is not true. It's not that the oneness is truth and the black and white is untrue. They are both true and they're both untrue. They are as true and as untrue as each other. And in fact, the two views make up the whole. And they are, because if you see the oneness and it obscures you from seeing the duality, meaning the black and the white, that's not clarity. That's a new form of delusion.
Yeah.
So there's a time and a place, and I think the process looks after that.
Yeah.
There is an intelligence guiding us.
And,
nice.
Yeah, that's what I was, when you said that before, that's why it gave me the memory of that piece of gravel. But you unpacked that brilliantly. I just as you did in your session at the conference, you take complicated questions, complicated ideas, and you make them sound very simple. And you did it again today. I want to thank you for this podcast, the Awareness Podcast. And I know we went in many different directions, but I feel that the audience had its chance to get to know you a little bit. And for you all that are listening or watching, you can find Roger Castillo at rogercastillo.org. And he has weekly satsangs, he has monthly intensives. And if you if you have a sense that you want to know more about his teaching, he's a spiritual teacher, and he's really amazing, as you can tell. And thank you all for listening and watching, and thank you, Roger Castillo, for being my guest on this broadcast.
Thank you, Bill. My pleasure.